Welcome to my channel, Single Mother, Silent Warrior. Today's story is not just about humiliation, it's about how fate sometimes waits for the most painful moment to change everything. I never planned to attend the reunion. In fact, if my three sons hadn't begged me with the dramatic desperation of tiny lawyers fighting a lost case, I would have stayed home eating instant noodles and pretending my life was perfectly fine. But when triplets look at you with identical puppy eyes and say, "Mommy, please, we want to see where you studied," resistance becomes impossible. So there I was, 34 years old, single mother, one borrowed dress, 3 energetic boys, and a heart that still carried scars from a past I tried hard to forget. The moment we entered the grand hotel hall, I knew I had made a mistake. Crystal chandeliers reflected light off expensive suits and designer dresses. Laughter echoed, loud, confident laughter of people who wanted the world to know they had made it. My sons squeezed my hands tighter. Noah whispered that the place smelled like rich people. Leo asked if everything here was free. Eli just stared at the chocolate fountain like it was a holy miracle. I smiled, but inside my stomach twisted. Then I saw him, my ex-husband, Daniel. He stood near the center of the hall, surrounded by people, laughing loudly as if life had never humbled him. His suit fit perfectly. His watch probably cost more than my yearly rent. And beside him stood his new wife, tall, elegant, visibly pregnant, glowing in the way society celebrates. When his eyes landed on me, the smile on his face didn't fade, it sharpened. "Well, well," he said loudly enough for people around to hear, "you actually came." I nodded politely, trying to move past him, but he stepped forward. His eyes dropped to my sons, then back to my face. "3 kids," he said with a laugh. "Looks like you stayed busy after I left." The laughter around us grew uncomfortable. My cheeks burned. Noah frowned. Leo crossed his arms. Eli asked innocently, "Mommy, why is this uncle talking like a villain?" A few people chuckled. Daniel's smile tightened. "Oh, relax," he said, waving his hand. "I'm just surprised. I mean, this reunion is about success, right?" His eyes scanned my simple dress. "Life must be challenging for you." I wanted to disappear. I wanted the floor to swallow me whole. But then something unexpected happened. My sons stepped forward, together. Noah spoke first. "Our mommy works very hard." Leo added, "She makes the best food even when there's not much." Eli finished, "And she never leaves us." Silence fell. Before Daniel could respond, a calm, deep voice spoke from behind us. "That," the man said, "is the greatest success anyone can have." We all turned. He was tall, composed, wearing a simple black suit. No flashy logos, no loud confidence, just presence. The room seemed to shift slightly toward him. Daniel's expression changed instantly. He knelt slightly to my son's level and smiled. "You 3 sound like remarkable young gentlemen." The boys beamed. Then he stood and looked at me. "You must be an extraordinary mother." I didn't know his name yet. I didn't know he was a billionaire. I only knew that for the first time that night, someone saw me. And that was only the beginning. Didn't realize how quiet the room had become until one of my sons whispered that everyone was staring like we had suddenly become famous. The man who had spoken up for us stood calmly beside me, as if he belonged there without needing to prove it. Daniel cleared his throat, forcing out an awkward laugh, the kind people use when their confidence slips, but their ego refuses to sit down. He stretched his hand toward the stranger and introduced himself with exaggerated pride, listing his job title and company as if reading a resume aloud. The man shook his hand politely, gave only his first name, Alexander, and said nothing more. That silence unsettled Daniel far more than any insult could have. My sons, however, were not impressed by adult tension. Leo tugged Alexander's sleeve and asked if rich hotels always had unlimited desserts. Eli wanted to know if the chocolate fountain was legally allowed to be that big. Noah asked the most dangerous question of all. "Are you famous?" Alexander laughed, a real laugh, not the rehearsed kind echoing around the hall. He told them fame was overrated, but good manners were priceless, which instantly earned him their approval. Daniel tried to regain control. He gestured around the ballroom and loudly offered to treat the kids, since, in his words, "I know things can be tight." That sentence landed like a slap. I felt my chest tighten, but before I could respond, Alexander calmly said, "No need. Children don't need charity, they need respect." A few nearby guests shifted uncomfortably. Someone coughed. Someone else pretended to check their phone. Daniel's wife placed a hand on his arm, whispering something that made his jaw clench. He forced a smile and suggested we all sit together. I declined politely. Alexander offered to walk us to a table instead. As we moved, I could feel eyes following us, curiosity replacing mockery. My sons waved cheerfully like tiny celebrities. Eli even bowed. I nearly laughed despite myself. At the table, Alexander asked about my children as if he genuinely cared. Their school, their interests, their favorite superheroes. When he asked about me, I hesitated, then told the truth. I worked 2 jobs. I was tired most days. Life hadn't gone as planned, but my children were my strength. He listened without interrupting, without pity, just respect. That alone felt like luxury. Across the room, Daniel kept glancing our way. His laughter grew louder, more forced. When the host took the stage and began acknowledging notable alumni, Daniel straightened proudly, expecting his moment. Names were announced. Doctors, CEOs, influencers. Then the host paused, smiling mysteriously, and said they were honored to welcome a special guest who had quietly funded scholarships for underprivileged students from our school for the past 10 years. The name, Alexander Hale, echoed through the hall. A ripple of gasps followed. Heads turned, phones came out. Daniel froze. Alexander beside me sighed softly, as if mildly inconvenienced. My sons stared up at him in awe. Noah whispered, "Mom, is he like superhero rich?" Leo added, "Can he buy the chocolate fountain?" Eli just smiled proudly, as if he had personally discovered him. Applause thundered. Daniel's face drained of color. His wife's grip tightened. Alexander stood briefly, nodded politely, then sat back down as the host continued praising his achievements: billion-dollar companies, global impact, humanitarian awards. I sat frozen, my mind racing. The man who defended me, the man who listened, was a billionaire. Daniel approached our table moments later. His tone completely changed. He congratulated Alexander enthusiastically, suddenly eager to talk business, partnerships, investments. Alexander listened politely, then said, "I'm actually in the middle of dinner with my friends." "Friends," he gestured to me and my children. Daniel's smile cracked. My sons, oblivious to the power shift, invited Alexander to try their dessert. He accepted. And in that moment, as laughter replaced humiliation and dignity replaced shame, I realized something had shifted, not just in the room, but in my life. The reunion that was meant to break me had become the doorway to something unimaginable, and fate was just getting started. After Daniel walked away, the air around our table felt lighter, as if someone had opened a window in a room that had been suffocating for years. My sons immediately relaxed, climbing onto their chairs like little kings who had survived a battlefield. Eli proudly pushed his dessert plate toward Alexander and told him sharing sweets was the highest form of friendship. Alexander accepted with mock seriousness, promising to honor the tradition. I watched this scene with a strange warmth in my chest, the kind I hadn't felt in a long time. Safe, seen, unjudged. People began drifting toward our table, pretending it was coincidence. Former classmates who had ignored me earlier suddenly remembered my name. Compliments flowed. about my children, about my strength, about how amazing single mothers were. I smiled politely, but inside, I understood the truth. They weren't seeing me. They were seeing the man sitting beside me. Still, Alexander seemed to notice the shift too. He leaned closer and quietly said, "You don't owe anyone your story." That simple sentence felt like armor. Daniel couldn't stay away. He returned again, this time alone, without his wife. His voice dropped as he spoke, no longer loud, no longer proud. He asked how I was managing, said he had always worried about me, hinted that maybe he could help with the boy's future. The audacity almost made me laugh. Before I could respond, Noah looked up at him and asked, very calmly, "If you worried so much, why didn't you stay?" Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time that night, he had no answer. Alexander stood then, not aggressively, just decisively. He thanked Daniel for checking in and suggested he return to his family. There was no threat in his tone, yet Daniel nodded like a scolded child and walked away. I felt a rush of relief mixed with something else, confidence. For years, Daniel's presence had made me feel small. Tonight, he looked ordinary. As the evening went on, Alexander stayed with us. He didn't dominate conversations or boast. He listened to my children's stories about school drama and superhero debates as if they were boardroom discussions. When the music started, Eli pulled him toward the dance floor. I nearly apologized, but Alexander laughed and let himself be dragged into chaos. Watching a billionaire awkwardly dance with triplet boys was possibly the most ridiculous and wonderful thing I had seen in years. At one point, I stepped aside to breathe. The weight of the night finally hit me. The humiliation, the unexpected kindness, the emotional whiplash. Alexander joined me quietly. He said he admired how my children spoke about me, how grounded they were. I admitted I often felt like I was failing, like no matter how hard I worked, it was never enough. He looked at me and said something that stayed with me. Strength doesn't always look like winning. Sometimes it looks like surviving with grace. Before we left, Alexander offered us his card, not with promises or pressure, just said if I ever needed anything, even advice, I could reach out. I hesitated, then accepted. The boys hugged him like they had known him forever. Daniel watched from across the room, his expression unreadable. As we walked out into the cool night air, my sons chattered excitedly about chocolate fountains and dancing billionaires. I smiled, exhausted but lighter. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know if Alexander would ever be more than a stranger who showed up at the right moment. But I knew one thing. That reunion had not ended the way my past expected it to. It ended the way my future demanded. Life didn't magically change the next morning. There was no dramatic phone call, no luxury car waiting outside my apartment. The alarm still rang too early, the boys still argued over toothpaste, and I still rushed to get everyone ready while mentally calculating expenses. Yet something inside me had shifted. I stood a little straighter. I spoke with a little more certainty. That night at the reunion had stitched up a tear in me I didn't even realize was bleeding. 2 days later, my phone buzzed while I was folding laundry, an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it, assuming it was another spam call, but something nudged me to answer. It was Alexander. His voice was calm, warm, unhurried. He said he hoped the boys were doing well and asked if I would be open to coffee. Just coffee. No pressure, no agenda. I hesitated for exactly 1 second before agreeing, mostly because my children were already chanting "Chocolate Fountain Man" in the background. We met at a quiet cafe, far from luxury hotels and judgmental eyes. Alexander arrived early, dressed simply, blending in. The boys instantly claimed a table and began debating pastries. As we talked, I learned more about him. Not the headlines, not the billionaire, just the man. He spoke about loneliness at the top, about trust being rare, about how power often attracted the wrong kind of people. I told him about nights I cried silently so my children wouldn't hear, about fear disguised as strength. There was no awkwardness, just honesty. Over the next weeks, he became part of our routine in small ways, helping with homework, showing up to a school event quietly, teaching the boys chess, then pretending to lose. He never tried to buy their love or mine. He showed up consistently, and that mattered more than any grand gesture. Daniel noticed, of course. He started calling more, asking questions he had no right to ask. When he finally confronted me, hinting that I was getting ideas above my station, I surprised us both by smiling calmly and saying, "I already know my worth." He didn't recognize the woman standing in front of him anymore, and that was the point. One evening, after the boys had fallen asleep in a pile of blankets and laughter, Alexander and I sat quietly. He admitted he admired me, not as a project, not as a rescue, but as a woman who built a life from ashes. I told him I wasn't looking to be saved. He smiled and said, "Good. I'm not looking to be a hero." In that moment, I understood something powerful. The billionaire didn't change my life. I did. He just witnessed it and chose to walk beside me. And for the first time in years, the future didn't feel like something to fear. It felt like something I deserved. The real test didn't come with love or comfort. It came the day my past tried to reclaim its power. Daniel showed up unannounced at my workplace, standing in the doorway like a ghost I had already buried. His tone was polite, almost soft, but the words carried the same old poison. He accused me of changing, of forgetting where I came from, of letting someone else's status go to my head. I listened quietly, something I never could have done before. When he finished, I simply told him that growth often looks like arrogance to those who stay the same. He left without another word. That night, I told Alexander everything. He didn't offer to fix it or fight my battles. He asked what I wanted. That question alone felt revolutionary. I realized I no longer wanted revenge or validation. I wanted peace, stability, a future where my children didn't learn fear from watching me shrink. Weeks later, the boys' school held a small award ceremony. Noah won for leadership, Leo for creativity, Eli for kindness. I stood in the back, heart bursting, hands shaking as I clapped. Alexander stood beside me, not in front, not behind. Daniel was there too, watching from a distance. For the first time, his presence didn't unsettle me. I wasn't competing anymore. I had already won. After the ceremony, as the boys ran off laughing, Alexander turned to me and said he had something to ask. He didn't kneel, he didn't make a scene. He simply asked if I would consider building a future together, slowly, honestly, with room for scars and laughter. I said yes, not because he was a billionaire, but because he saw me when I had nothing to offer but truth. The boys celebrated like it was a holiday. They declared Alexander officially ours. I laughed, cried, and held them close. In that moment, I realized the reunion wasn't the climax of my story. It was the beginning. So, if you're listening to this and you've been humiliated, dismissed, or made to feel small, remember this. Your worth isn't decided in rooms where people measure success by money and noise. Sometimes, the quiet strength of surviving becomes the loudest victory of all. Thank you for being part of Single Mother Silent Warrior. Your story isn't over either. Life did not transform overnight, and that was the most important lesson of all. There were no fairy tale mornings where problems disappeared or where confidence suddenly arrived, fully formed. What changed was subtle, almost invisible to anyone watching from the outside. I woke up the same way, prepared lunches the same way, rushed through crowded streets the same way. But inside me, something had realigned. The humiliation from the reunion no longer replayed in my mind like a wound. Instead, it sat quietly behind me, like a chapter already written and closed. Alexander never tried to step into my life as a savior. That was the difference. He didn't rewrite my story or claim ownership of my struggle. He respected it. Some evenings, he would sit quietly at our small dining table, listening as the boys argued about homework or teased each other over who ate more dessert. He never interrupted their chaos. He observed it with a softness that told me he understood what stability really looked like. Stability wasn't luxury, it was presence. There were moments when fear crept back in, late nights when bills stacked up, school forms that reminded me how alone I still was in responsibility. I caught myself pulling back emotionally, preparing for disappointment the way survival had trained me to do. Alexander noticed, but he didn't confront me. Instead, he stayed consistent, the kind of consistency that doesn't demand trust, but earns it. My children changed too, though quietly. Noah began speaking with more confidence, as if watching me stand taller had given him permission to do the same. Leo laughed more freely, his jokes brighter, less guarded. Eli became gentler, offering help without being asked. Children absorb strength the way they absorb fear. They had lived through both with me. Daniel, on the other hand, could not accept the shift. He watched from a distance, confused by a power he no longer held. When he finally confronted me again, it wasn't with cruelty, it was with disbelief. He asked how I had moved on so completely. I didn't answer immediately. Then I realized the truth was simple. I hadn't moved on because someone better came along. I had moved on because I stopped seeing myself through his eyes. That realization didn't come with anger, it came with clarity. I no longer needed him to acknowledge my worth. I had already done that myself. One evening, after the boys fell asleep in a heap of blankets and laughter, Alexander and I sat quietly. No dramatic confessions, no promises, just honesty. He spoke about the loneliness that success often brings, about how power isolates instead of protects. I spoke about exhaustion, about fear disguised as strength, about how motherhood had carved parts of me away and rebuilt others stronger. We didn't try to impress each other, we simply existed truthfully in the same space. That was when I understood something profound. Love is not loud. Healing is not dramatic. Growth doesn't announce itself. It happens quietly in moments when you realize you are no longer afraid of being seen. I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't afraid of judgment, of abandonment, of being misunderstood. I had survived all of that already. What I felt now was unfamiliar but steady, a sense of direction. For the first time since becoming a single mother, my future didn't feel like a narrow tunnel. It felt open. And yet, the journey was not finished, because the greatest test was still ahead. The moment that changed everything did not arrive with flashing lights or dramatic music. It came quietly, the way real transformations always do. One ordinary afternoon, while I was sitting at the kitchen table helping the boys with homework, I realized I wasn't rushing anymore. My shoulders weren't tight. My breath wasn't shallow. For years, urgency had lived inside me like a permanent alarm, reminding me that if I slowed down even for a second, everything might fall apart. That afternoon, the alarm was silent. It startled me more than any chaos ever had. I watched my sons argue over a math problem, their voices overlapping, their laughter spilling into the room, and I realized something terrifying and beautiful at the same time. I was no longer surviving, I was living. And when survival ends, fear often tries to reclaim its territory one last time. That fear showed up in the form of opportunity. Alexander invited me to attend a foundation event with him. Not as decoration, not as a symbol. He told me clearly that I was free to say no. The event would be filled with people who spoke the language of power fluently, people who had once looked at me the way my classmates had at the reunion. Old instincts screamed at me to decline, to stay invisible, to stay safe. That night, I stood in front of the mirror for a long time. Not because I didn't have something to wear, but because I was facing a version of myself that still believed she didn't belong in rooms where decisions were made. Then I remembered my sons standing up for me without hesitation. I remembered the reunion. I remembered humiliation didn't kill me. Silence didn't protect me. Only courage had ever moved me forward. So, I said yes. The event was elegant, polished, intimidating in its own quiet way. But something unexpected happened. I wasn't shrinking. I wasn't apologizing with my posture. I spoke when spoken to. I listened when listening mattered. I didn't perform strength. I embodied it. And people noticed. Not because of Alexander, because of me. A woman approached me near the end of the evening. She didn't ask who I was dating or how I knew anyone. She asked about my work, about my children, about my story. And for the first time, I told it without shame. Not the version softened for comfort, the real one. The nights of exhaustion, the fear, the resilience. When I finished, she said something that rewired me permanently. She said, "You don't sound broken. You sound forged." On the drive home, Alexander was quiet. Then he said he admired how I carried myself, how I never abandoned who I was to fit where I stood. I told him something I had never said out loud before, that I didn't fear being alone anymore, that if our paths ever separated, I would still be whole. He smiled, not wounded, not threatened, but proud. That was when I knew we were choosing each other freely, not out of need. Daniel's final attempt came months later. He asked to meet. I agreed, not out of obligation, but closure. He apologized, not perfectly, not fully, but honestly enough to reveal regret. I listened. I forgave him silently, without announcing it. Forgiveness, I learned, doesn't require reconciliation. It requires release. When we parted, there was no heaviness, only distance, clean and final. The boys grew. Childhood softened into confidence. They watched how love was supposed to look. Not dramatic, not controlling, not loud, but respectful and steady. One evening, Noah said something I will carry forever. He said, "Mom, you're not strong because you never fell. You're strong because you stood back up without becoming bitter." Years later, when people ask how my life changed, I don't mention money, I don't mention status. I tell them this: I stopped letting the worst moment of my life define the rest of it. I stopped confusing suffering with identity. I stopped asking for permission to take up space. And if you're listening to this story right now, feeling unseen, underestimated, or exhausted, I want you to understand something deeply. Your quiet endurance is not invisible. Your struggle is not small. Your journey is not late. Some lives bloom only after they are tested. I walked into that reunion humiliated, judged and dismissed. I walked out with my dignity intact. But the real victory didn't happen that night. It happened every day after, when I chose not to shrink back into the shadows. This was never a story about a billionaire. It was always a story about a woman who remembered who she was. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying. And welcome to Single Mother, Silent Warrior.